Hi there. My name is Karen Fabian, and I'm the founder of Bare Bones Yoga. In the next few minutes, I'm going to share with you how to build your confidence as a yoga teacher so that you can show up more authentically in your classes, feel more like yourself, feel less pressure and stress, and make a bigger impact on your students. When I was putting together this story, I was reminded of my client, Chloe, who's a yoga teacher who struggled a great deal with her confidence. Chloe would notice her nerves starting to ramp up Sunday night as she anticipated teaching her yoga classes for the week ahead. Is my sequence good enough, she'd think? Maybe I should just change it. She'd practice it over and over and rewrite her notes, hoping that it would help her feel better. But by the time her first class of the week arrived, she was in a full-blown panic. On her drive to the studio, she'd wonder, is all of this worth it? But Chloe's not alone in her struggle as a yoga teacher. Maybe for you, it shows up as imposter syndrome. I'm not good enough. Or comparison to other teachers. I just took her class and she's so much better than me. Or pressure. It needs to be perfect. And then there's the family member who doesn't get it, such as the husband who has a sense that you're getting nervous and says, honey, it's not like it's brain surgery. What are you so nervous about? What all this comes down to is a crippling confidence problem. So, how might you typically go about fixing this? Maybe you try to feel better by over preparing. Maybe you create a new sequence every week, believing that the one you already know and have used isn't good enough, and your students won't like you if you teach a similar sequence from class to class. You might also practice your cues and write them down while you're doing the sequence, only to find out when you get to the studio, your mind's a blank and you have to practice with them anyway. You then overanalyze how it went, attempting to talk yourself out of whatever bad feelings come up. But when that doesn't work, you start to wonder, am I really cut out for this? Instead, imagine walking into the room with a sense of excitement. Imagine greeting your students, sharing a few words about what to expect, and then beginning your class with no notes and not even the urge to put a mat down. Imagine moving through the room, providing instructions, and seeing yourself that they're listening and understanding what you say. Imagine as the end of class nears and the students are resting in the final pose, you feel inspired to share a few words of your own rather than reading from a book. Imagine feeling like you're doing just what you were born to do. But how might this be possible? How might you go from the crippling lack of confidence that Chloe had to this other experience of connection, confidence, and fulfillment? Yoga teaching is a special kind of role, isn't it? It not only can erode our confidence, it can stir up uncomfortable feelings from a long time ago, such as reminding you of the time you answered a question incorrectly in school. Unlike other areas of expertise and skill, teaching yoga involves not only instruction, but also public speaking, managing a group, sharing from your own words, and showing up as an expert, teaching a framework that's been around for thousands of years. In today's world, it also involves moving beyond a set of rules given in teacher training to a way of teaching that's more authentic, more you. Without the ability to build your confidence, all you're left with is believing that you have to do everything you've been told. You write down your script, you build a sequence with a peak pose, you change your sequence every week. You follow all the rules, even though they don't change how you feel. But the simple truth is that students don't come into class for an original sequence or a perfectly delivered script. What they actually want is to have agency over their own experience. This means that even if they're falling all over the place, it's still a win for them because they're in class and they're practicing yoga. Students want clear cues and a space where they can find presence and peace. As I worked with Chloe, she began to see that the pressure and dread she was feeling before teaching was coming from a part of her that was telling her she wasn't good enough and she wasn't going to be able to do it right. I call that the inner critic. She described this feeling as overwhelming, and it left her feeling like she was at rock bottom. When I explored with her where this inner voice came from, she said it reminded her of her dad and the things he'd say to her when she was young. She said he was hard on her and her sisters, and she could hear his voice in her head when she taught. This created inner tension for her because, as much as she wanted to teach, her experience was so negative because it reminded her of times as a child when she couldn't meet his expectations. As she taught yoga, she kept repeating this cycle of negative self talk. Because she had this belief that perfect was the only acceptable outcome, she could never meet this expectation when she taught. The bar of an acceptable class for her was, it has to be perfect as defined by me, not I showed up confidently and authentically. When we worked together, she said, I need to change my sequence every week or my students will get bored. She had a very rigid way of thinking, which is very common. How do you know your students will get bored? I asked. Do you think people will come up to you and say, hey, your class is boring? Well, no, she said. And even if someone did, I asked, does that mean every student shares that perspective? Of course not, she said. So what if you just played with teaching the class 4 weeks in a row to see what happens? Is that something you'd be willing to try? I suppose so, she said. Maybe if it's just 4 weeks. And within a couple of weeks of that conversation, everything changed. On our next coaching call, she told me that she felt a huge shift. Her confidence was growing, and she was experimenting with teaching the same sequence from class to class with no effect at all on attendance or anything else. No one seemed to mind. And what's more important, she was able to get better at the sequence, and that helped to build her confidence. But how did what we discussed wind up having such a huge impact on her? Beliefs often come from what we were told as a child before we even had free will over what to believe. Yoga teachers have that past experience that leads to their beliefs, plus all of what they're told in teacher training. Much of how yoga teachers are trained is based on a guru model, where one person provides the training and shares their model of teaching. Many teachers give up their own sense of agency to the person who trained them, even going so far as to say, I'm teaching this way because that's the way I was trained, or I'm using these cues because that's what I was trained to say. And so imagine you as the teacher want to try something new, like having the same basic sequence instead of creating a new one every week. You might then commit yourself to no longer changing up the sequence from now on. But the energy behind a commitment when it comes to behavior change comes from the same place as willpower. It reinforces a rigid way of thinking, which is exactly what causes so much of the confidence problem. In my conversation with Chloe, we opened the door to other possibilities and approaches. We framed it like a science experiment. The real magic of experimenting comes from using a new approach and then evaluating the results. The teacher who believes at an identity level that she's shy and she could never walk around the room and teach, so she hides in her own practice as she teaches, she could experiment with walking in the room, greeting the class, and experimenting with standing in front of them as she teaches the first 3 or 4 poses, even though she's nervous and it feels awkward. With just that one experiment, she starts to loosen her belief around her identity just a little. Starting with that first experiment can then lead to teaching more of poses from standing, which could then lead to walking around the room. Pretty soon, she's tossed her rigidly held belief simply by being willing to experiment with a new approach. Chloe and many other teachers have transformed their teaching with this approach because your confidence as a yoga teacher comes less from the hours of training you've completed and more from your willingness to experiment. It's through trying things but not committing to them that you can shift the belief that have kept you in fear and hidden your confidence. This can take shape in all sorts of ways. For the teacher who believes that inspiration for her students has to come from yoga books and who doesn't think she has anything of value to share with her class, she can experiment with sharing 2 or 3 sentences from her own heart at the end of class. The teacher who believes she needs to use music in her classes can experiment with a delay in turning on the music until 10 minutes after class start, and then turn it off 10 minutes before class ends. A teacher who constantly asks for feedback can experiment with teaching a class where she doesn't ask anyone for feedback afterwards. A teacher who believes that a class is only worth it when it includes harder poses and complex transitions can experiment with teaching a class that focuses on the essentials. There are many other examples as well. But the larger point is that if you're struggling with your confidence and even enjoyment as a yoga teacher, making a rigid commitment to a new way of doing things will just feel like pressure. And if you find it hard to do, that inner critic will get even louder. This could have been the case with Nadia, but she turned things around. Nadia thought that she wasn't the sort of teacher who could prep before class, so she spontaneously came up with the bulk of the sequence once she was there. She also found she was influenced by other teachers, and she felt she wasn't nearly as good as them. We talked about this more so we could uncover the belief that prevented her from prepping, which was that she thought her class would be boring. We also talked about the idea of holding off from taking class with teachers that caused her to play the comparison game, even if it was just for a few weeks. That inspired her to do some research, and she actually found another class in her area to attend that didn't trigger feelings of not being as good as another teacher. She also took a little time to write down one of the sequences she was already teaching and found she actually enjoyed the process of doing it. More importantly, when she used it in her classes, she found it allowed her to walk around more and feel more confident because she didn't have to spend time creating the sequence on the fly. Chloe's and Nadia's experience show that your confidence as a yoga teacher comes less from the hours of training you've completed and more from your willingness to experiment. If you show up in your teaching in this way, everything will take shape differently moving forward. So now you know the secret to confident teaching. And while you've learned the secret, the how to get there is what's missing and how to make it work for you. This is what I can show you. Just like I've shown dozens of yoga teachers who have enrolled in my program. You can see their results by clicking the link on this page. And you can take the next powerful step by enrolling yourself. And when you do, there's a special bonus in it for you, an extra month in the program at no extra cost. So imagine yourself walking around the room, feeling confident with no urge to practice with your students, helping them with their poses, the cues coming easily from what you know, and feeling empowered and like you're truly making a difference. I can't wait to see your enrollment come through. And if for any reason at all you have any difficulty with the link, you can find it on the Enroll Now button on my website at barebonesyoga.com. I can't wait to see your enrollment come through.